Thanksgiving night, while the smell of roasted turkey mixed with wood smoke, my cousin's joke about my tiny apartment landed as hard as the folder I gripped under the table. Silas Drayton, 52. Internal auditor, steady hands, except for the cool tick of my pocket watch in my coat. Ever felt a holiday table shift before anyone says a word? It was just after 5 when my phone lit up, the screen glowing against the dim office. My mother's voice came through with its usual warmth that always carried a sting, a kind of casual barb wrapped in sugar. Still living in that tiny apartment, Silas, Thanksgiving's next week, and you'll finally see what a real house feels like again. I pinched the bridge of my nose, stared at the muted glow of the gray Cincinnati skyline beyond my office window, and told her I'd be there, my voice even, and polite. I didn't bother to tell her the apartment suited me fine, or that the mortgage on that tiny place was already cleared. The line clicked off with her usual, "Drive safe, honey," leaving only the low hum of the space heater to fill the silence. At almost the same instant, a red folder landed on my desk with a dull slap. Its spine was cracked. Corners curled the top page, stamped in thick black letters. Urgent. Drayton Academy. Eliza Carr. Our legal counsel stood in the doorway, like she always did, hands clasped, expression calm enough to make anyone nervous. "Read it soon," she said, lowering her voice, though no one else was around. "There's more here than numbers." She gave a brief nod and disappeared down the hall, her heels clicking once, twice, then fading entirely. The heater kicked again, rattling faintly like it was sharing a secret. I slid a finger beneath the frayed edge and opened it. Inside were sheets of grim arithmetic and formality delinquent payroll stretching 2-month state audits flagged a pending IRS lien marked in red like a wound. Each page whispered a little more rot. A personal guarantee appeared halfway through my father's full name, Cliff Drayton, and my mother's signature looping as always at the end of Ivy. My stomach sank the way it used to when I was a boy, and the winter wind seeped through my bedroom window, slow, cold, unavoidable. They had taken a chunk of their retirement savings and fed it into Malcolm's dream school, the one he never stopped boasting about at every holiday dinner, the one now sliding towards state receivership like a ship to the bottom. Outside, the late November sky had gone from iron to ink. I set the folder flat, leaned back in my chair, and let the wheels creak beneath me. My fingers traced the ownership chart on page 5. Drayton Academy wasn't listed as such. It was wrapped in a shell called Hamilton Learning Holdings and LLC with a Delaware address and a barely there paper trail. At the top in neat type sat a single name, M. Drayton. I could almost hear Malcolm's voice from last Thanksgiving, smooth and buoyant, telling anyone who'd listen about expansion opportunities and being courted by Boston investors while I stood by the sink refilling water glasses. I closed the folder, but kept my hand on its cover, feeling the texture of its cracked spine under my thumb. There was a chill threading through the office, the kind that didn't come from air, but from the knowledge that the ground beneath your family was shifting. Eliza's words lingered more here than numbers. She didn't need to say what she meant. Beacon could acquire the academy, keep it afloat, even save my parents' nest egg. But doing that meant Malcolm would lose the crown he'd worn since we were kids, and the family would finally see who had been keeping the beams steady all along. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the watch Ruth Ann had given me years ago, a heavy silver piece with a face slightly dulled by time. Its hands ticked evenly each movement, a reminder that waiting wasn't the same as standing still. I turned it over in my palm, felt the faint engraving on the back. Patience isn't silence. The heater hummed once more, steady as the second hand. Alone in the soft glow of my desk lamp, with the city lights flickering far below, I whispered to the empty room, "Time will tell, if I can." I set the watch on the edge of my desk beside the red folder and let the two sit together like conspirators. Outside, a lone horn sounded on the river, long and low, a reminder that even on the stillest nights, something is always moving. I didn't move for a while. The folder stayed shut, the watch ticked, and the office breathed with the hum of the heater. Somewhere above all that quiet, a plan was already forming, one page at a time, each tick pulling me closer to what I knew had to come. The next morning, the cold had a way of sneaking beneath my coat as I walked the narrow, brick-lined street toward Kersey's Cafe. The place was a holdout from another decade, its sign still painted by hand, its windows fogged from a heater that sounded older than me. Inside, the air was thick with burnt espresso and cinnamon rolls, the kind that clung to your sweater long after you left. Ruth Ann was already seated at the corner booth, where the light from the front window slanted across the scratched wooden table and caught the silver streaks in her hair. A folded newspaper sat in front of her like a card waiting to be played. She didn't bother with pleasantries, just pushed the paper toward me with 2 fingers. The headline, bold and accusatory, sprawled across the page, State Review targets local charter. I didn't need to read the subtext. I knew exactly which school it meant. Malcolm's Academy was a magnet for glossy magazine spreads and holiday toasts, but the state didn't review thriving schools without cause. The black ink felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of our family name, along with the failing accounts.
You don't need to shout.
Silas. Ruth Ann, said her voice low, carrying over the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. Just be ready when the room goes quiet. She was always like this. Her words measured each one placed like a stone in a river path. No rush, no flourish, just enough to get you across. I turned the newspaper over and set it down more to escape the headline than anything. My reflection warped in the window beside us, the gray morning light making me look older, maybe closer to Ruth Ann's 70 than my own 52. She leaned back, wrapping both hands around her mug, and asked Cliff and Ivy, did they put their retirement into that school too? The question wasn't a guess. She already knew. Ruth Ann had been my father's neighbor long before I was born. She'd seen how my parents treated Malcolm's ventures like gospel, each new pitch a sermon they couldn't resist. I nodded once, watching the steam curl from her coffee. I've seen the documents. They pulled more than they could afford. Half of it's wrapped up in loans, Malcolm guaranteed, and the rest is tangled. I didn't say the word sinking. She didn't need me to. Ruth Ann's eyes, pale and steady, didn't flinch. She set her cup down carefully, the ceramic landing with a soft click against the saucer. Then, you already know this isn't about humiliating him. It's about making sure your parents still have a home to sit in when the dust settles. She pulled a small notepad from her coat pocket, flipping to a page marked with a paperclip. On it were neat lists, email subjects, file codes, names of vendors owed back pay. She tapped the page lightly. Gather every receipt, every memo. Let Eliza vet it. And then she paused. Say nothing. Not until the table's full and the plates are set. People listen differently when the room is dressed for gratitude. The bell over the cafe door chimed, letting in a gust of wind that rattled the blinds. I stared at her list, each line another nail in Malcolm's careful facade, and felt the knot in my stomach tighten. It wasn't anger that settled in me, not yet. It was the quiet dread of knowing how this would look when it finally broke open. My brother stripped of his armor, my parents forced to see who had really been holding the floor steady. I slid the notepad back across the table and stood my knees creaking a little as I straightened. Outside, the street looked colder, the kind of gray that seeps into your skin. As I stepped through the door, My hand brushed the cool metal of the pocket watch in my coat. Its steady tick cut through the muffled street sounds, each beat echoing the weight Ruth Ann had just laid on me. I closed my fingers around it, felt the faint engraving beneath my thumb, and let the rhythm steady my breath. I didn't look back at the cafe window as I walked. The cinnamon and coffee smell clung to me, mingling with the cold, a reminder of the quiet plan taking shape. The tick of the watch grew louder in my mind, with each step a private metronome marking the time until Thanksgiving, when silence would finally give way to something sharper. ChatGPT, done I. 3 nights later, the diner near the rail yards felt like a place time had mostly forgotten. Its neon sign buzzed against the November dark, casting a pale blue glow across the condensation beating on the windows. Inside, the air carried the sharp tang of motor oil drifting in from the loading docks and the heavier scent of fried onions clinging to the vinyl booths. I sat across from Ruth Ann, my jacket still zipped despite the heat, staring at a burger that had gone cold, the cheese hardened at the edges like dried paint. Her coffee steamed gently untouched as she slid a thick manila envelope across the table toward me. Its frayed corner snagged briefly on the Formica surface before I caught it. "Loan agreements annotated," she said, her tone practical, almost clinical. "Emails too, enough to show intent without getting you sued for defamation when this finally surfaces." Her fingers lingered on the envelope for a moment, as if reluctant to let it go. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, washing her lined face in a pale strobe before steadying. I kept my eyes on the envelope, feeling the weight of it, even before I opened it. I flipped it open slowly, the paper inside, whispering as I drew out the first stack. Malcolm's name appeared in bold headers, always attached to promises of expansion funding and strategic partnerships, the same words he used at family dinners to make himself sound untouchable. Buried deeper in smaller type and stiffer language were his private plans to move Academy assets into a holding company 1 step ahead of creditors. The kind of shell game you don't play unless you're desperate to keep a crown no one has formally handed you, but everyone seems to polish anyway. My phone buzzed beside my untouched plate. Jonas's name lit the screen, the only lawyer I trusted outside Beacon's walls. I answered, cupping a hand over the receiver to muffle the diner noise. His voice was low, deliberate. "If you confront Malcolm now, the board will bury it as family friction. They'll make you the distraction. Let Eliza build the record first. Make them see facts, not a feud." His line went quiet for a beat. Then, "And for what it's worth, Silas, he's not the first golden child I've seen unravel like this. Just keep breathing." I thanked him and hung up, letting the phone rest beside the burger gone rubbery with neglect. The coffee pot on the counter hissed, releasing a fresh curl of steam into the air, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer dinged, but no one rushed to answer it. Ruth Ann was watching me with that calm steadiness she wore like a second coat.
"Jonas is right,"
she said, folding her hands atop the menu stained with grease. "This isn't about catching him red-handed tonight. It's about building a story no one can dispute when it counts." I took the pen she slid toward me, my thumb grazing the worn groove along its barrel, and signed the retention letter Eliza had drafted. My name, shaky in the diner's dim light, bled a little into the cheap carbon paper beneath. The act felt heavier than I expected, like each loop of ink locked me further into a role I'd been avoiding for years. I placed the signed page back into the envelope and sealed it with a slow press of my palm, the paper edges warm from the friction. Outside, a freight train barreled past, the sound swelling until the windows trembled in their frames. Neon light from the sign buzzed and flickered as the rumble subsided, leaving the diner in a pocket of eerie stillness. I slipped the envelope into my bag, feeling the corner bite against my side, and muttered to no one in particular, "Thanksgiving, then." The hiss of the coffee pot and the faint, rhythmic hum of the neon sign answered me in place of Ruth Ann. She simply nodded, taking her first sip of coffee as if to mark the end of the conversation. I stood leaving the cold burger untouched and stepped into the chill outside. The night smelled of metal and exhaust, and as I zipped my coat higher, the distant clang of the rail yard bells felt like a countdown I couldn't yet stop, only count along with. ChatGPT, Danai. The wind was already seeping through the thin seams of the window frame by the time I heard the knock. It wasn't a polite tap, but the kind of knock my parents had used since I was a boy, firm and insistent, the sound of people who didn't wait for invitations. I opened the door to find Ivy smiling, cheeks pink from the cold, a pie cradled in her gloved hands like an offering. Cliff stood just behind her, hunched against the gust that funneled down the hallway, his expression polite but distracted. They stepped in as if they'd done it yesterday, though it had been months. My apartment felt smaller the instant they crossed the threshold, their winter coats shedding flecks of snow onto my worn rug. "Malcolm says the expansion deal will double enrollment by spring," Ivy said, before I could even hang their coats. Her voice carried a practiced cheer, the kind she saved for holiday tables and family photos. She placed the pie on the counter, still warm enough to fog the glass lid, and glanced around the apartment with that soft squint she got when she thought she was hiding judgment. Cliff rubbed his hands together and nodded along, murmuring something about how Malcolm's always been a visionary, his tone more rehearsed than convinced. I leaned against the counter, letting their words roll over me, the hum of the radiator filling the pauses they didn't notice. They didn't ask about my work at Beacon, didn't mention the red folder or the numbers I'd been sifting through all week. To them, I was still the son who lived modestly, the one who kept spreadsheets tidy while Malcolm built futures. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and set them down, though neither of them reached for the cups. My phone buzzed on the counter. A new message flashed across the screen from Malcolm Stay, quiet.
"Don't ruin the holiday."
The words glared against the dim light, each one a reminder that he knew I'd seen too much. I turned the phone face down, pressing my palm over it like I could smother the irritation rising in my chest. Ivy was still talking about projected enrollments, Cliff nodding beside her, both oblivious to the storm swirling around their golden child. I slid a hand into my coat pocket and felt the familiar weight of the watch Ruth Ann had given me, cool against my palm. For a moment, it steadied me, the quiet tick, a reminder to hold my course. Then, as I shifted my grip, it slipped. The metal clattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing crack. I stooped quickly, heart thudding, and picked it up to find the lid snapped off its hinge, a deep scratch running along the once smooth casing. The watch still ticked, but the sound felt sharper now, as if each beat was slicing the air. Ivy and Cliff didn't seem to notice, lost in their conversation about Malcolm's next board presentation. I set the broken watch on the counter beside the untouched pie, its crust cooling and hardening as the minutes passed. When they finally stood to leave, Cliff offered a half smile and Ivy a peck on the cheek, both still buoyed by the image of Malcolm's grand plans. The door closed behind them with a muted thud, and the apartment sank into a silence, broken only by the rattle of the window frame in the wind. I picked up the watch again, tracing the jagged edge of the scratch with my thumb, and whispered to the dim room, "Some things break before they change." My breath fogged in the cool air as I crossed to the wall calendar tacked beside my desk. With a red marker, I circled Thanksgiving, a thick, deliberate ring that bled slightly into the page. I stood back and watched the circle glow faintly under the lone lamp, the soft hum of the radiator blending with the distant honk of a horn somewhere below on the street. I closed the blinds, letting the room darken, and slipped the cracked watch into my pocket, its uneven tick following me as I moved through the apartment, already counting down the days. ChatGPT, Dan I. The smell of roasted turkey and wood smoke hit me before I even reached the top step of the Drayton house. Inside, the air was thick with the chatter of cousins I barely recognized, the clink of glasses, and the steady crackle from the fireplace that painted the walls in flickering amber. Malcolm stood near the head of the dining table, his blazer unbuttoned, one hand resting on a wine glass that he topped off more often than he sipped. His voice carried easily over the room, bright and confident, as he spoke about new campuses and growth opportunities, the phrases rolling off him as smoothly as the Bordeaux he poured. Across the table, a younger cousin, one of Ivy's nieces, I thought, giggled, as she repeated the old jab about my apartment, how it must be cozy for one, and the room answered with a polite wave of laughter. I smiled the same faint curve I'd practiced for years, and let my hands rest on my lap, fingers brushing against the stiff edges of the folder beneath the tablecloth. The warmth of the lights above felt far away. My hands were cold, despite the fire's glow. Ruth Ann sat 2 seats down, her posture easy, her eyes steady on mine. When Malcolm launched into another monologue about interested investors out of Boston, she tilted her head just slightly, a calm nod that said, "What words didn't need to. It's almost time." I breathed in slow, catching the faint pop of a log shifting in the hearth, the shuffle of utensils as plates were cleared for the next course. Ivy, seated beside Malcolm, reached for her glass and turned toward me with a smile too practiced to be casual. Still keeping things simple. Silas, I suppose it must be nice not to worry about square footage or, keeping up with Malcolm's projects. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just familiar, the kind that had followed me through decades of holiday tables. I nodded once, my voice soft when I answered, "It does keep life uncomplicated." Ruth Ann broke the rhythm of the room, her voice calm but cutting through the murmur. "Malcolm," she said, tilting her head, as though in curiosity, "how are the investors taking the state review?" Her tone was conversational, but the question landed like a small hammer on the table. The silverware stilled, and for a moment, the only sound was the fire. Malcolm's smile tightened. He swirled his wine buying time, his gaze flicking toward me as though expecting rescue or confrontation. "Just the usual due diligence?" he said lightly, his voice a shade too quick. "Nothing out of the ordinary." But his knuckles whitened around the stem of the glass, and a cousin at the far end shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The hum of conversation faltered, replaced by an uneasy shuffle of plates and glasses. I let my fingers curl tighter around the folder and the deed in my lap, feeling the corners press into my palms. The warmth of the house, the golden lights, the laughter, all of it receded behind the drumbeat of my pulse. As Malcolm's smile wavered, and the room hovered in that thin space between chatter and silence, I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood, and rose to speak. The room was still humming with forced small talk when I pulled the folder from beneath the tablecloth and placed it squarely in the center. The polished wood creaked softly as the weight landed, and beside it, I set the property deed, its embossed seal catching the glow of the chandelier. The sound of paper meeting wood shouldn't have been loud, but it cut through the room like a bell. Even the fire behind Malcolm seemed to quiet its crackle, softening into a faint hiss. No one spoke for a beat. Malcolm shifted in his chair, wine glass in hand, and forced a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. Another report. Silas, he said lightly, though the tremor in his voice and the way his knuckles whitened around the stem betrayed something closer to dread. You always bring work to dinner, don't you? His gaze flicked to the seal on the deed, then back to me, a silent plea or warning I couldn't quite tell apart. I didn't bother with preamble. That, I said, nodding to the deed, is the title to the property your academy has been operating out of.
It's worth $5 million, and it now belongs to Beacon under a structured acquisition deal.
This, I continued tapping the audit summary with 2 fingers, is a breakdown of debts, vendor invoices, unpaid payroll, and arrears and loans personally guaranteed by Mom and Dad. All of it, weeks from default. The silence deepened. Ivy's eyes darted to Cliff, her hand clutching the edge of the tablecloth, as though it might keep her steady. Cliff stared down at the audit pages, as if the numbers themselves were written in another language. Malcolm straightened, drawing in a breath. Temporary setbacks. He said, his tone just shy of defiant. Every business has them. Expansion takes time, and expansion doesn't require hiding assets in a Delaware shell. I interrupted softly, not raising my voice. It doesn't drain retirement accounts without disclosure. This isn't about growth. It's about survival, and you are willing to gamble with more than just your own name. I slid one of the reports forward, the paper whispering against the table. The chandelier's light caught on the deed's embossed seal, a dim reflection pulsing across the wood like a heartbeat. Ruth Ann rose quietly from her chair, her presence somehow calming the tension rather than adding to it. She rested a hand on Ivy's shoulder, leaning close to murmur, "It's not about shame. It's about saving what can be saved before it's gone." Her voice was steady low, the kind you listen to even when you don't want to hear the words. Ivy's breath caught audibly, her eyes glassing as she absorbed the reality their nest egg, decades in the making, had been weeks away from disappearing entirely. Malcolm opened his mouth again, then shut it, his jaw working as if he might grind his teeth down to dust. The room felt smaller, the golden lights suddenly dimmer, shadows stretching long across the hardwood floor as the evening outside slipped into full dark. Eliza's voice floated from the speakerphone I'd placed on the table earlier, cool and factual. The acquisition terms will stabilize operations. Cliff and Ivy's retirement contributions are protected. Malcolm will no longer hold any controlling or operational role. No one reached for their glasses. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire, steady but subdued. I gathered the papers, slowly sliding the deed back into its folder, feeling the stiff edges press into my palm. Malcolm set his wine glass down the base, clicking softly against the wood, and, for once, he had nothing to add. I rose from my chair, tucking the folder under my arm. "I'll let you finish your dinner," I said, my tone even almost quiet enough to be mistaken for courtesy. The room didn't answer, only the low murmur of the fire and the chandelier's faint hum as it swayed slightly above. I turned toward the hallway, the folder's weight a steady anchor in my hand, and left the table behind my footsteps, soft against the hardwood, as I slipped into the silence beyond the dining room's glow. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle as I stepped into O'Malley's Clockworks. The air inside was warmer than the street, thick with the scent of pine oil and old brass, like time itself had a smell. Wooden panels lined the walls, each holding clocks in every shape and age, pendulums swinging in quiet unison. Tiny hands, ticking in patterns, only they seemed to understand. At the counter, O'Malley hunched over a pool of lamplight, his fingers steady, despite the tremor in his shoulders, polishing the battered pocket watch I'd left with him 2 days earlier. The winter sun barely pierced the frosted windows, streaks of pale light casting long bars across the counter. I stood silent, listening to the scratch of his cloth on the metal, each motion deliberate. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. Ruth Ann's text glowed on the screen. Not every crack needs hiding. Some remind us we waited long enough. I read it twice, my thumb hovering over the reply button, before I slid the phone back, letting her words settle without answer. O'Malley glanced up once, his face a map of years and patience, and handed the watch over the counter without a word. The lid clicked softly as he tested the hinge, the faint scratch still visible along the casing despite his polishing. It ticked evenly steady and calm, as if to remind me that it didn't need to be perfect to keep time. I rolled it in my palm, feeling the subtle groove where the metal had once split, and slipped it into my coat pocket, the weight familiar and grounding. Outside, the cold met me with a rush, snowflakes drifting in lazy arcs through the gray air. I walked without thinking, boots scuffing against the salted sidewalk, until I found myself standing before the locked gates of Drayton Academy. The building loomed quiet windows, dark, its sign half buried under a thin layer of snow. I wrapped my fingers around the cold iron bars and looked at the flaking paint on the letters, the place where Malcolm's name had once been stenciled bold and now faded like it was never there. "Time to start something better," I murmured the words, barely louder than the wind moving through the empty lot. My breath hung white in the air for a moment, before disappearing, leaving only the soft hiss of snowflakes landing on the pavement. I let go of the gate, the metal cold enough to sting my fingers, and turned back toward the street. As I walked, the watch ticked steadily in my coat pocket, louder against the winter silence than the distant hum of traffic. The sound was not hurried, not sharp. It was the kind of rhythm that carries you forward without pulling you apart. Ahead, the streetlights were already flickering on, casting warm halos onto the snow, and I stepped into their glow without looking back at the dark building behind me. ChatGPT, Danai. The building that had once carried Malcolm's banner now hummed with a softer, steadier life. A year had passed, and the halls, freshly painted in warm earth tones, echoed with children's voices instead of silence. The smell of new wood and chalk drifted through the air as the Drayton Community Foundation opened its doors for the first time. Morning sunlight poured through wide windows, pooling on the polished floors and catching the edges of desks arranged in neat rows. There were no banners, no speeches booming through speakers, just a quiet hum of activity, parents chatting softly, and the light patter of sneakers down the hall. In my office, tucked near the front of the building, a glass case stood on a simple wooden shelf. Inside, the pocket watch ticked steadily, its face gleaming. Beneath the light, the faint scratch along its casing, a reminder that some marks are meant to stay. The sound was soft, but present, a constant rhythm beneath the distant echoes of laughter and chatter in the corridors. I stood for a moment, listening, the weight in my chest that had carried through the last year finally easing into something lighter. Ruth Ann appeared in the doorway, dressed simply, her presence as grounding as ever. She didn't speak at first, just followed my gaze to the watch and gave a small nod, her lips curving in the barest suggestion of a smile. Behind her, Jonas was gesturing to a pair of volunteers unloading boxes of supplies, his quiet efficiency, the perfect counterbalance to Ruth Ann's calm watchfulness. I stepped out into the hall, trailing my hand along the smooth frame of a classroom door, feeling the hum of life that had been missing from these walls for so long. Inside rows of sturdy desks, held children bent over worksheets, their heads bobbing as they whispered to each other in hushed excitement. A mother waited by the door with a folded note in her hand, her fingers smudged faintly with ink. She pressed it into mine without a word before hurrying back toward the lobby. I unfolded it slowly. "Thank you for noticing us." It read, the handwriting uneven, the letters slanted like the words had been written quickly, perhaps with more relief than grace. I folded it back along its creases and slipped it into my pocket, letting the texture of the paper anchor me as I continued my rounds. Later, in the small multi-purpose room we'd repurposed for gatherings, I stood before a modest group of parent staff and a few city officials. My words were brief, measured the way I preferred. "Some structures," I said, glancing once at Ruth Ann in the back, "are built to shine for a moment. Others are built to last longer than applause. This one's for the long haul." The applause that followed was polite, not raucous, and that was exactly how I wanted it. As the day wound down and the last visitors filtered out, I returned to my office. The city beyond the window hummed softly, the late autumn sun already dipping low. I sat at my desk, the room empty, save for the faint echo of distant voices, and let my eyes rest on the watch in its case. Its tick was steady, unhurried, a sound that filled the silence without breaking it. "Time well spent." I whispered the words, barely above a breath. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on one by one, each glow another small sign that the world kept moving quietly and surely, just like the watch. The autumn sun dipped low behind the renovated foundation, casting long amber streaks across the quiet office, as the steady tick of my mended pocket watch marked the close of another day. It reminded me that some things don't need to return flawless to be whole. Justice had its place, but it was the rebuilding the classrooms filled with laughter, the neighbors who finally felt seen, that gave the fight meaning. Sometimes bridges collapse, so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone facing a loss, a fracture, or a change, know that the cracks can guide you toward sturdier ground. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story or thoughts. Below, I'd like to hear how time has carried you too.